I sometimes speculate as to what humanity might have become if the first settlers on Santa Rosalia had been the original passenger list and crew for the nature cruise of the century. Captain von Kleist Shirley and Hisako Hiraguchi and Selina McIntosh and Mary Hepburn, and instead of the Kankabono girls, the sailors and officers and Jacqueline Onassis and Dr. Henry Kissinger and Rudolf Nureyev and Mick Jagger and Paloma Picasso and Walter Cronkite and Bobby King and Robert Pepin, the greatest chef in France, and of course Andrew McIntosh and Zenji Hiraguchi, and on and on. The island could have supported that many individuals just barely. There would have been some struggles, some fights, I guess some killings even, if food or water ran short. And I suppose some of them would have imagined that nature or something was very pleased if they emerged victorious. But their survival wouldn't have amounted to a hill of beans as far as evolution was concerned if they didn't reproduce, and most of the women on the passenger list were past childbearing age, and so not worth fighting for. During the first 13 years on Santa Rosalia, before Akiko reached puberty, in fact, the only fertile women would have been Selina, who was blind, and Hisako Hiraguchi, who had already given birth to a baby all covered with fur, and 3 others who were normal. And probably all of them would have been impregnated by victors, even against their will. But in the long run, I don't think it would have made much difference which males did the impregnating, Mick Jagger or Dr. Henry Kissinger, or the captain or the cabin boy. Humanity would still pretty much be what it is today. In the long run, the survivors would still have been not the most ferocious strugglers, but the most efficient fisher folk. That's how things work in the islands here. There were live Maine lobsters who also came within a hair of having their survival skills tested by the Galapagos archipelago. Before the Bahia de Darwin was looted, there were 200 of them in aerated tanks of salt water in the hold. The waters around Santa Rosalia were surely cold enough for them, but perhaps too deep. There was this about them, at any rate. They were like human beings in that they could eat almost anything if they had to. And Captain von Kleist, when he was an old man, remembered those lobsters in their tanks. The older he became, the more vivid were his recollections of events of the long ago. And after supper one night, he amused Akiko, the furry daughter of Hisako Hiraguchi, with a science fiction fantasy whose premise was that the Maine lobsters had made it to the islands and that 1,000,000 years had passed, as they have indeed passed now, and that lobsters had become the dominant species on the planet, and had built cities and theaters and hospitals and public transportation and so on. He had lobsters playing violins and solving murders and performing microsurgery and subscribing to book clubs and so on. The moral of the story was that the lobsters were doing exactly what human beings had done, which was to make a mess of everything. They all wished that they could just be ordinary lobsters, particularly since there were no longer human beings around who wanted to boil them alive. That was all they had to complain about in the first place, being boiled alive. Now, just because they hadn't wanted to be boiled alive anymore, they had to support symphony orchestras and on and on. The viewpoint character in the captain's story was the underpaid second chair French horn player in the Lobsterville Symphony Orchestra, who had just lost his wife to a professional ice hockey player. When he made up that story, he had no idea that humanity elsewhere was on the verge of extinction and that other life forms were facing less and less opposition in case they had a tendency to become dominant. The captain would never hear about that, and neither would anybody else on Santa Rosalia, and I am speaking only of the dominance of large life forms over other large life forms. Truth be told, the planet's most victorious organisms have always been microscopic. In all the encounters between Davids and Goliaths, was there ever a time when a Goliath won? On the level of the big creatures then, the visible strugglers, lobsters were surely poor candidates for becoming as elaborately constructive and destructive as humankind. If the captain had told his mordant fable about octopi instead of lobsters, though, it might not have been quite so ridiculous. Back then, as now, those squishy creatures had highly developed brains, whose basic function was to control their versatile arms. Their situation, one might think, wasn't all that different from that of human beings with hands to control. Presumably, their brains could do other things with their arms and brains than catch fish. But I have yet to see an octopus, or any sort of animal for that matter, which wasn't entirely content to pass its time on Earth as a food gatherer, to shun the experiments with unlimited greed and ambition performed by humankind. As for human beings making a comeback of starting to use tools and build houses and play musical instruments and so on again, they would have to do it with their beaks this time. Their arms have become flippers, in which the hand bones are almost entirely imprisoned and immobilized. Each flipper is studded with 5 purely ornamental nubbins, attractive to members of the opposite sex at mating time. These are, in fact, the tips of 4 suppressed fingers and a thumb. Those parts of people's brains which used to control their hands, moreover, simply don't exist anymore. And human skulls are now much more streamlined on that account. The more streamlined the skull, the more successful the fisher person. If people can swim as fast and far as fur seals now, what is to prevent their swimming all the way back to the mainland, whence their ancestors came? Answer: nothing. Plenty have tried it or will try it during periods of fish shortages or overpopulation, but the bacterium which eats human eggs is always there to greet them. So much for exploration. Then again, it is so peaceful here. Why would anybody want to live on the mainland? Every island has become an ideal place to raise children, with waving coconut palms and broad white beaches and limpid blue lagoons. And all the people are so innocent and relaxed now, all because evolution took their hands away. Quoth Mandarax, in works of labor or of skill I would be busy too, for Satan finds some mischief still for idle hands to do. Isaac Watts, 1674 to 1748. There was this Peruvian pilot a million years ago, a young lieutenant colonel who had his fighter bomber skipping from wisp to wisp of finely divided matter at the very edge of the planet's atmosphere. His name was Guillermo Reyes, and he was able to survive at such an altitude because his suit and helmet were inflated with an artificial atmosphere. People used to be so marvelous, making impossible dreams they made come true. Colonel Reyes had had an inconclusive discussion with a fellow airman one time as to whether anything felt better than sexual intercourse. He was in contact on his radio now with that same comrade who was back at the air base in Peru, and who was to tell him when Peru was officially at war with Ecuador. Colonel Reyes had already activated the brain of the tremendous self-propelled weapon slung underneath his airplane, That was its first taste of life. But already it was madly in love with the radar dish atop the control tower at Guayaquil International Airport, a legitimate military target, since Ecuador kept 10 of its own warplanes. There. This amazing radar lover under the colonel's plane was like the great land tortoises of the Galapagos Islands, to this extent. It had all the nourishment it needed inside its shell. So the word came that it was all right for him to let the thing go. So he let the thing go. His friend on the ground asked him what it felt like to give something like that its freedom. He replied that he had at last found something which was more fun than sexual intercourse. The young colonel's feelings at the moment of release had to be transcendental, had to be entirely products of that big brain of his. Since the plane did not shudder or yaw or suddenly climb or dive when the rocket departed to consummate its love's affair. It continued on exactly as before, with the automatic pilot compensating instantly for the sudden change in the plane's weight and aerodynamics. As for effects of the release visible to Reyes, the rocket was much too high to leave a vapor trail, and its exhaust was clean, so that to Reyes it was a rod which quickly shrank to a dot and then to a speck and then to nothingness. It vanished so quickly that it was hard to believe that it had ever existed. And that was that. The only residue of the event in the stratosphere had to be in Reyes' big brain or nowhere. He was happy. He was humble. He was awed. He was drained. Reyes wasn't crazy to feel that what he had done was analogous to the performance of a male during sexual intercourse. A computer over which he had no control once he had turned it on had determined the exact moment of release and had delivered detailed instructions to the release machinery without any need of advice from him. He didn't know all that much about how the machinery worked anyway. Such knowledge was for specialists. In war, as in love, he was a fearless, happy-go-lucky adventurer. The launching of the missile, in fact, was virtually identical with the role of male animals in the reproductive process. Here was what the colonel could be counted on to do. Deliver the goods in an instant. Yes, and that rod, which became a dot, and then a speck, and then nothingness so quickly, was somebody else's responsibility now. All the action from now on would be on the receiving end. He had done his part. He was sweetly sleepy now, and amused, and proud. And I worry now about skewing my story, since a few characters in it were genuinely insane and giving the impression that everybody a million years ago was insane. That was not the case. I repeat, that was not the case. Almost everybody was sane back then, and I gladly award Reyes that widespread encomium. I don't know what that word means. And I gladly award Reyes that widespread encomium. The big problem, again, wasn't insanity, but that people's brains were much too brig. Almost everybody was sane back then, and I gladly award Reyes that widespread encomium. The big problem, again, wasn't insanity, but that people's brains were much too big and untruthful to be practical. true. Like, it's not insanity. It's fucking, it's this equipment. What a fucking god. Absolute god. No single human being could claim credit for that rocket which was going to work so perfectly. It was the collective achievement of all who had ever put their big brains to work on the problem of how to capture and compress the diffuse violence of which nature was capable, and drop it in relatively small packages on their enemies. I myself had had some highly personal experiences with dreams come true of that sort in Vietnam, which is to say, with mortars and hand grenades and artillery. Nature could never have been that predictably destructive in such small spaces without the help of humankind. Man, what a fucking book. I have already told my story about the old woman I shot for throwing a hand grenade. There are plenty of others I could tell, but no explosion I saw or heard about in Vietnam could compare with what happened when that Peruvian rocket put the tip of its nose, that part of its body most richly supplied with exposed nerve endings, into that Ecuadorian radar dish. No one is interested in sculpture these days. Who could handle a chisel or a welding torch with their flippers or their mouths? If there were a monument out here in the islands, though, celebrating a key event in the past, that would be a good one. The moment of mating, right before the explosion between that rocket and that radar dish. Into the lava plinth. Beneath it, these words might be incised, expressing the sentiments of all who had had a hand in the design and manufacture and sale and purchase and launch of the rocket, and of all to whom high explosives were a branch of the entertainment industry. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616. 20 minutes before the rocket gave that French kiss to the radar dish, Captain Adolf von Kleist concluded that it was now safe for him to come down from the crow's nest of the Bahia de Darwin. The ship had been picked clean and had fewer amenities and navigational aids even than had Her Majesty's ship Beagle when that brave little wooden sailboat began her voyage around the world on December 27, 1831. The Beagle had had a compass, at least, and a sextant. And navigators who could imagine with considerable accuracy the position of their ship and the clockwork of the universe because of their knowledge of the stars. And the Beagle, moreover, had had oil lanterns and candles for the nighttime, and hammocks for the seamen, and mattresses and pillows for the officers. Anyone determined to spend the night on the Bahia de Darwin now would have to rest his or her weary head on nude steel, or perhaps do what Hisako Hiraguchi would do when she couldn't keep her eyes open any longer. Hisako would sit on the lid of the toilet off the main saloon and lay her head on her arms, which were folded atop the wash basin in there. I have likened the mob at the hotel to a tidal wave whose crest swept past the bus, never to return again. I would say that the mob at the waterfront was more like a tornado. Now that ferocious whirlwind was moving inland in the twilight and feeding on itself, since its members had themselves become worth robbing, carrying lobsters and wine and electronic gear and drapes and coat hangers and cigarettes and chairs and rolls of carpeting and towels and bedspreads and on and on. So the captain clambered down from the crow's nest. The rungs bruised his bare and tender feet. He had the ship and the entire waterfront all to himself as far as he could see. He went to his cabin first, since he was wearing only his undershorts. He hoped that the looters had left him a little something to wear. When he turned on the light switch in there, though, nothing happened because all the light bulbs were gone. There was electricity anyway, since the ship still had her banks of storage batteries down in the engine room. The thing was, the light bulb thieves had blacked out the engine room before the batteries and generators and starter motors could even be stolen. So in a sense, they had unwittingly done humanity a big favor. Thanks to them, the ship would still run. Without her navigational aids, she was as blind as Selena McIntosh, but she was still the fastest ship in that part of the world, and she could slice water at top speed for 20 days without refueling, if necessary, provided nothing went wrong in the pitch-dark engine room. As things would turn out, though, after only 5 days at sea, something would go very much wrong in the pitch-dark engine room. The captain certainly had no plans for putting out to sea as he groped about his cabin for more clothes to hide his nakedness. There wasn't even a handkerchief or a washcloth in there. Thus was he having his first taste of a textile shortage, which at the moment seemed merely inconvenient, but which would be acute during the 30 years of life still ahead of him. Cloth to protect his skin from sunburn in the daytime and from chills at night simply would not be available anymore. How he and the rest of the first colonists would come to envy Hisako's daughter Akiko for her coat of fur. Everybody but Akiko, until Akiko herself had furry babies, would in the daytime have to wear fragile capes and hats made of feathers tied together with fish guts. Quoth Mandarax to the contrary, man is a biped without feathers. Plato, 427 to 347 BC. The captain remained calm as he searched his cabin. The shower in the head was dripping, and he turned it off tight. That much he could make right away. That much he could make right anyway. That was how composed he was. As I have already said, his digestive system still had food to process. Even more important to his peace of mind, though, was that nobody was counting on him for anything. Those who had looted the ship almost all had numerous relatives in dire need, who were starting to roll their eyes and pat their bellies and point down their throats like the Kankabono girls. The captain was still in possession of his famous sense of humor and freer than ever to indulge it. For whose sake was he now to pretend that life was a serious matter? There weren't even rats left on the ship. There had never been rats on the Bahia de Darwin, which was another lucky break for humankind. If rats had come ashore with the first human settlers on Santa Rosalia, there would have been nothing left for people to eat in 6 months or so. And then after that, the rats, after having eaten what was left of the people and each other, would themselves have died. Quoth Mandarax, rats! They fought the dogs and killed the cats, and bit the babies in the cradles, and ate the cheeses out of the vats, and licked the soup from the cook's own ladles, split open the kegs of salted sprats, made nests inside men's Sunday hats, and even spoiled the women's chats by drowning their speaking with shrieking and squeaking in 50 different sharps and flats. Robert Browning, 1812 to 1889. The captain's clever fingers working in the blacked-out head, now encountered what would prove to be half a bottle of cognac sitting atop the tank of his toilet. This was the last bottle of any sort still aboard the ship, and its contents were the last substance to be found from stem to stern, and from crow's nest to keel, which a human being could metabolize. In saying that, of course, I exclude the possibility of cannibalism. I ignore the fact that the captain himself was quite edible. And just as the captain's fingers got a firm grip on the bottle's neck in the darkness, something big and strong outside gave the Bahia de Darwin an authoritative bump. Also, there were male voices from the boat deck, one deck below. The thing was, the tugboat crew, which had delivered fuel and food to the Colombian freighter San Mateo, was now preparing to haul away the Bahia de Darwin's 2 lifeboats. They had cast off the ship's bowline, and the tug was nosing her bow into the estuary, so that the lifeboat on her starboard side could be lowered into the water, so that the ship was now married to the South American mainland by a single line at her stern. Poetically speaking, that stern line is the white nylon umbilical cord of all modern humankind. The captain might as well have been my fellow ghost on the Bahia de Darwin. The men who took our lifeboats never even suspected that there was another soul aboard. All alone again except for me, he proceeded to get drunk. What could that matter now? The tugboat, with the lifeboats following obediently, had disappeared upstream. The San Mateo, all lit up like a Christmas tree, and with the radar dish atop her bridge revolving, had disappeared downstream, so that the captain felt free to shout whatever he pleased from the bridge without attracting unfavorable attention. His hands on the ship's wheel, he called into the starlit evening, "Man overboard!" He was speaking of himself. Expecting nothing to happen, he pressed the starter button for the port engine. From the bowels of the ship came the muffled, deep purple rumble of a great diesel engine in perfect health. He pressed the other starter button, giving the gift of life to the engine's identical twin. These dependable, uncomplaining slaves had been born in Columbus, Indiana, not far from Indiana University, where Mary Hepburn had taken her master's degree in zoology. Small world. That the diesel still worked was to the captain simply one more reason to make himself wild and stupid with cognac. He switched off the engines, and it was a good thing he did. If he had let them run long enough to get really hot, that temperature anomaly might have attracted the electronic attention of a Peruvian fighter bomber in the stratosphere. In Vietnam, we had heat-sensing instruments so sensitive that could actually detect the presence of people, or at least big mammals of some kind, in the night, because their bodies were just a little bit warmer than their surroundings. One time I called in an artillery barrage on a water buffalo. Usually it was people out there trying to sneak up on us and kill us if they could. What a life! I would have loved to put down all my weapons and become a fisherman instead. And that was the sort of thing the captain was thinking up there on the bridge. What a life! And so on. It was all very funny, except he didn't feel like laughing. He thought that life had now taken his measure, had found him not worth much of anything, and was now through with him. Little did he know! He went out on the sun deck, which was aft of the bridge, and the officers' cabins, his bare feet on bare steel, now that the sun deck had been stripped of its carpeting. The plugged holes which were supposed to receive the mounts for weapons were plainly visible, even in starlight. I myself had welded 4 of the plates on the sun deck. Most of my work, and my finest work, however, was deep inside. The captain looked up at the stars, and his big brain told him that his planet was an insignificant speck of dust in the cosmos, and that he was a germ on that speck, and that nothing could matter less than what became of him. That was what those big brains used to do with their excess capacity. Blather on like that. To what purpose? You won't catch anybody thinking thoughts like that today. So then he saw a shooting star. A meteorite burning up on the edge of the atmosphere, up where Lieutenant Colonel Reyes in his space suit had just received word that Peru was officially at war with Ecuador. The shooting star cued the captain's big brain to have him marvel yet again about how unprepared people were for meteorites striking the Earth's surface. And then there was this tremendous explosion out at the airport as the rocket and the radar dish honeymooned. The hotel bus, all painted up outside with the blue-footed boobies and marine iguanas and penguins and flightless cormorants and so on, was at that moment parked in front of a hospital. The captain's brother Siegfried was about to go inside to get help for James Waite, who had lost consciousness. Waite's heart attack had necessitated this detour on the way to the airport, which had surely saved the lives of all on board. The great bubble of the shock wave from that explosion was as dense as bricks. To those on the bus, it seemed that hospital itself had exploded. The windows and windshield of the bus were blown inward, but turned out to have been shatterproof. They had not turned to shrapnel. Mary and Hisako and Celino and Kazak and Porb, Waite and the Kankabono girls and the captain's brother were pelted with seeming kernels of white corn instead. This would happen on the Bahia de Darwin as well. The windows would all be blown in and white kernels would be underfoot everywhere. The hospital, so full of light only moments before, was blacked out now, as was the whole city, and there were cries for help coming from inside. The engine of the bus was still running, thank God, and its headlights illuminated a narrow pathway through the debris up ahead. So Siegfried, becoming more palsied by the second, still managed to drive away from there. What help could he or anybody else on the bus be to the survivors, if any, in the blasted hospital? And the logic of the maze of rubble directed the creeping bus away from the center of the explosion, the airport, and toward the waterfront. The road across the marsh from the edge of the city to the deepwater wharves was, in fact, almost clear of wreckage. There was so little for the shock wave to knock down out there. Siegfried von Kleist drove to the waterfront because it was the path of least resistance. Only he could see where they were going. The others were still on the floor of the bus. Mary Hepburn had dragged the unconscious James Waite away from the Kankabono girls, so that he was lying flat on his back now with her lap for a pillow. The big brains of the Kankabonos had shut down entirely for want of even a wisp of a theory as to what was going on. Hisako Hiraguchi and Selina McIntosh and Kazak were similarly immobilized. And everybody was deaf, since the shock wave had done such violence to the bones in their inner ears, the tiniest bones in their bodies, nor would any of them recover their sense of hearing entirely. With the exception of the captain, the first colonists on Santa Rosalia would all be slightly deaf, so that a good deal of their conversations would consist in one language or another of and speak up, and so on. This defect, fortunately, was not inheritable. Like Andrew McIntosh and Zenji Hiraguchi, they would never find out what hit them, unless there were answers to questions like that at the far end of the blue tunnel into the afterlife. They would accept the captain's theory that the explosion, and another explosion still to come, had been the impacts of white-hot boulders from outer space. But not wholeheartedly, since the captain would prove to be laughably mistaken about so many things. The captain's palsied younger brother, his ears ringing, some of his hearing returning, stopped the bus on the wharf near the Bahia de Darwin. He had not expected her to be a haven. He was unsurprised to find her dark and apparently deserted, with her windows blown in, her lifeboats missing and barely secured to the wharf by a single line at her stern. Her freed bow was some distance from the wharf, so that her gangplank dangled over water. She had, of course, been looted, like the hotel. The wharf was littered with wrappings and cartons and other trash discarded by scavengers. Siegfried did not expect to see his brother. He had heard that the captain had left New York, but not that he had actually reached Guayaquil. If the captain was somewhere in Guayaquil, he was very likely dead or injured or In any case, in no position to be of much help to anyone. Nobody in Guayaquil at that point in history was in a position to be of much help to anyone else. Quoth Mandarax, "Help yourself, and heaven will help you." Jean de La Fontaine, 1621 to 1695. The most Siegfried hoped to find was a peaceful stopping place in chaos. This he did. There did not seem to be anybody else around. So he got out of the bus to see if he couldn't somehow get the involuntary dancing movements caused by Huntington's chorea under control by doing exercises, jumping jacks and push-ups, and deep knee bends and so on. The moon was coming up. And then he saw a human figure rising to its feet on the sun deck of the Bahia de Darwin. It was his brother. But the captain's face was in shadow, so Siegfried did not recognize him. Siegfried had heard whispered stories about the ships being haunted. He believed that he was beholding a ghost. He thought it was me. He thought he was seeing Leon Trout.